Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are wrestling with a pretty massive slice of history.
Oh, yeah, it's a big one.
We're looking at the era where the map of Europe, and honestly the very idea of what a state actually is, started to solidify into something we'd recognize today.
Right.
So we are covering the period from 1648 right up to 1850.
And I'd argue it's probably the most pivotal time for the formation of modern politics. I mean, if you are a student prepping for the AP European history exam, you really need to pay attention here.
Definitely.
We are squarely in Unit 3, which is the Age of Sovereignty. And this unit alone usually accounts for about 10 to 15% of your total exam score. So
That is a huge chunk.
it is heavy. Yeah.
So the mission today is to unpack all of this. We got a stack of sources here: historical analyses, economic theories, legal documents, and they all revolve around one central question.
Which is, how should power be organized after the collapse of religious unity?
Right, because we start in 1648, which is the Peace of Westphalia.
Exactly. The end of the 30 Years' War. That is the exact moment Europe effectively said, you know, we are done fighting over whose version of Christianity is correct.
We're going to fight over power and land instead.
Power, land, and money. Yes.
Yeah.
State sovereignty basically replaces religious unity. And then this whole era ends in 1815 with the Congress of Vienna.
When they're trying to put the pieces back together after Napoleon kind of wrecked the board.
Right. So between those two dates, we see this intense struggle between two competing operating systems for running a country. You've got Absolutism and Constitutionalism.
And what's wild to me in the sources is that while they're really heavy hitters, like France, Russia, Prussia, they all went all in on dictators and absolute kings. But you had these two stubborn exceptions that went the complete opposite direction.
Yeah, the rebels, England and the Dutch Republic.
Let's start there, because looking at the map in, say, 1650, going the constitutional route seems like a terrible bet. I mean, France is huge and unified. England is just a chaotic mess at this point.
Oh, an absolute mess.
Why did the English stumble down this road of sharing power?
Stumble is definitely the perfect word for it. Because it wasn't some grand, planned, philosophical experiment.
Yeah.
No, it was basically a street fight over cash.
Over taxes.
Always over taxes. So you have the Stuart monarchs, right? James I and his son Charles I. And they firmly believed in the divine right of kings.
Which is the idea that God personally put them on the throne.
Right.
So asking them about taxes or laws is basically questioning the Almighty.
Precisely. But there was a massive practical glitch in that theology.
Parliament had the checkbook.
Exactly. The English king couldn't legally levy taxes without Parliament's consent. So whenever Charles I wanted to fight a war or, I don't know, renovate a palace, he had to ask them for money.
And he hated that.
He hated it so much he just stopped asking. The sources talk extensively about the personal rule.
Yeah, those 11 years where he just ignored Parliament entirely.
Right. He tried to rule like a French king, but on an English budget. He was reviving all these obscure medieval fines just to scrape by.
Ship money and all that.
Exactly. But then the Scots rebelled because Charles tried to force English religious practices onto them.
And wars are expensive.
Very. He went totally broke. He had to call Parliament.
And Parliament, understandably, wasn't really in a giving mood.
Not at all. And this triggers the English Civil War.
Which I think we often gloss over just how radical this event was.
Oh, it was earth-shattering.
It wasn't just a political dispute, it was like a psychological break for the entire country.
It shattered the whole worldview of the time. You really have to picture this. It's 1649. The king god's anointed representative on earth is put on trial by his own subjects.
And he refuses to even enter a plea.
Right, because he doesn't believe a mortal court has any jurisdiction over him.
But they convict him anyway, and then they cut his head off.
Rage aside.
Just a total shock to the system.
It sent shockwaves through every royal court in Europe. It screamed that the king is not the state. The people, represented by Parliament, are the state.
But, and here's the irony that the sources really point out, they kill the quote-unquote tyrant king, and they end up with Oliver Cromwell.
Ah, yes, the Lord Protector.
Who acts suspiciously like a dictator himself.
Oh, he absolutely was a dictator. This is that period we call the interregnum, literally meaning between kings.
Right.
Cromwell was a military genius. He led the New Model Army. But he was also a puritanical buzzkill.
Banned theater.
Banned theater, banned Christmas, essentially banned fun. And he eventually dismissed Parliament, too, just like Charles had done.
So the English experiment with the Republic basically fails. Cromwell dies,
Mm.
and they just invite the king back in 1660, the Restoration.
Yep.
It feels like they went in a giant circle.
Well, it looks like a circle, but the geometry of power had completely changed.
How so?
The restored Kings Charles II and James II, they knew they had a ceiling now. They knew what could happen. But James II, well, he pushed it.
Right, he was openly Catholic in a fiercely Protestant country.
And he started appointing Catholics to high military and political office. So Parliament got really nervous about a return to absolutism.
But they didn't want another bloody civil war.
No, nobody wanted that. So they orchestrated a coup instead. The Glorious Revolution of 1688.
Where they invite James's Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange to just come in and invade.
And James fled without even putting up a fight.
But this time, Parliament learned their lesson. They weren't just handing over the keys to the kingdom.
That is the crucial difference. Before William and Mary could actually be crowned, they had to sign the English Bill of Rights in 1689.
So this is kind of the major takeaway for this section. The Bill of Rights essentially killed absolutism in England.
Permanently.
It codified that the king cannot suspend laws, cannot raise taxes without consent, and cannot ignore Parliament.
It established true parliamentary sovereignty. You see, in France, the king was the state. But in England, the king was now an employee of the state.
An expensive one with a fancy hat.
Sure, but an employee nonetheless.
Now, you mentioned William was Dutch. And that really perfectly connects us to the other major anomaly of this era, the Dutch Republic.
Right.
Because if England was politically messy, the Dutch Republic seems downright improbable.
It really shouldn't have worked. I mean, it was this tiny collection of 7 swampy provinces that had just barely survived a brutal war of independence against Spain.
And they didn't even have a king.
No king at all. They had this incredibly decentralized system.
The sources describe it as a merchant oligarchy.
Exactly. Each province had its own assembly called an estate, and those were dominated by wealthy burghers.
And they had a stadtholder, right?
Yeah, but that was mostly a military role for defense. The real day-to-day power lay entirely with the merchants.
And despite being so small and having no strong central monarch, they were punching way above their weight. I mean, this is the Dutch Golden Age.
They literally had the highest standard of living in all of Europe. And the engine for that was maritime capitalism. They realized pretty quickly that if you live in a swamp and can't grow a ton of food, you have to trade.
So they built ships.
Lots of ships. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, built this massive global fleet and essentially cornered the world's spice market.
And there's a fascinating insight in the reading about their culture here. The Dutch were famous for being tolerant of different religions, but the sources imply it wasn't just because they were, exceptionally nice people.
No, it was pure pragmatism. Intolerance is just bad for business.
Right.
Look at Spain. If you kick out the Jews and the Protestants, you are kicking out your bankers, your skilled artisans, your merchants. The Dutch looked at that and said, hey, come on in.
We don't care how you pray as long as you pay.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And that massive influx of talent and capital is what made Amsterdam the banking center of the world. It funded the incredible art of Vermeer and Rembrandt.
So while Louis XIV was bankrupting France to force everyone to be Catholic, the Dutch were getting rich by just being open. That is a perfect transition to the actual engine that kept all these states running. Because we can talk about kings and parliaments and politics all day, but you really can't have a modern state without a modern economy.
You absolutely cannot. You have to feed the beast. And that starts, quite literally, with feeding the people. We have to talk about the agricultural revolution.
Which I know, to a lot of people, sounds incredibly dry. The thrilling history of turnips.
I know it sounds boring. But you have to think of it this way. Before this period, almost every village in Europe was just one bad harvest away from outright starvation.
Because of the fallow field system.
Right. You had to leave a third of your land fallow, just sitting there empty, to let the soil naturally recover its nutrients.
Which is a massive waste of real estate.
Huge waste. But then comes the scientific farming movement.
Where the Dutch and the British figured out crop rotation.
Yes. You plant nitrogen-restoring crops like turnips and clover in that empty field instead of leaving it bare.
And then the farm animals eat the turnips.
The animals eat the turnips, their manure fertilizes the soil, and suddenly you are actively using 100% of your land every single year.
Plus you get new technology, like Jethro Tull's seed drill.
Right, which planted seeds at the perfect depth in rows instead of a farmer just throwing seeds haphazardly onto the dirt.
And the result of all this is just a massive population explosion. Food output tripled.
Tripled.
But here is the kicker. And this really connects to the social hierarchy themes for the AP exam. If you are way more efficient at farming, you don't need as many farmers.
Exactly. And this leads to the enclosure movement in England. Wealthy landlords literally fenced off the old communal lands so they could do this high-tech, large-scale farming.
Which systematically pushed poor peasants off the land.
It did. And where did they go?
They went to the cities.
They flocked to the cities. This created the massive wave of urbanization that would eventually fuel the Industrial Revolution.
It's a harsh reality to think about. Progress for the state often meant total displacement for the poor.
It's a running theme in history.
So now we have more people, we have bigger cities. But how were these early modern states actually thinking about money? Because they weren't using free market capitalism yet.
No, Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations don't show up until 1776. For most of the period we're discussing, the absolute dominant economic playbook was mercantilism.
Which is basically a zero-sum game.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Mercantilists believed that global wealth was fixed.
Like a pie.
Right. If France gets a bigger slice of the pie, more gold, then England inherently has a smaller slice. There's no concept of growing the economy.
So the entire goal of the state is just to hoard bullion. Gold and silver.
Hoard as much as possible. And to do that, you need a favorable balance of trade. You want to sell lots of expensive finished goods to other countries, but you refuse to buy anything from them.
And that economic theory is what makes colonies so incredibly valuable.
Indispensable.
Because if you own a colony, you can force them to give you their raw materials for basically nothing, and then you force them to buy your manufactured goods. It's completely closed loop.
It is.
But we really have to address the darkness at the bottom of this loop. Because this wasn't just about trading timber and furs. This entire global economy was heavily powered by human misery.
Yes. The Atlantic system, the triangular trade. You really cannot separate the rise of European state power from the horrors of the slave trade.
Millions of Africans were kidnapped.
Millions. Transported via the Middle Passage under horrific conditions to work the sugar, tobacco, and coffee plantations in the Americas.
And the sources point out this deeply disturbing connection to the European consumer at the time. We always think of the Age of Enlightenment with these educated people sitting around in coffee houses in London and Paris discussing philosophy and liberty.
But what are they drinking while they discuss liberty?
Coffee.
Coffee, sweetened with sugar, maybe they're smoking tobacco. All of those commodities were exclusively produced by enslaved labor.
The Consumer Revolution, where ordinary middle-class people could suddenly afford these luxuries, was entirely built on that exploitation.
It's the great paradox of the era. Liberty and constitutional rights were expanding in Europe, while brutal chattel slavery was expanding in their colonies.
And all that extracted wealth allowed these European states to massively scale up their power. And when states get rich, what do they buy?
They buy guns. Lots of them.
Which brings us perfectly to the new geopolitical game of the era, the balance of power.
Right.
Now, this is a phrase that gets thrown around a lot in history classes, but in 1648, it really became the official rule book for Europe.
Because religious unity was dead, you couldn't rely on the Pope to step in and mediate disputes anymore, so diplomacy became entirely about math and secular power.
You have to constantly weigh the scales.
Exactly. If one state, let's say France, under Louis XIV, gets too heavy, too powerful, all the other states have to band together into a coalition to add weight to the other side.
So it wasn't actually about maintaining peace.
No, not at all.
It was just about preventing a monopoly.
Preventing any one nation from achieving hegemony over the continent. And enforcing that balance required a massive military revolution.
We aren't talking about medieval knights and feudal levies anymore, are we?
No, we are talking about highly trained, professional standing armies. Louis XIV, at his peak, had 400,000 men in uniform.
400,000 in the 17th century. That is wild.
It was completely unheard of. But think about the sheer logistics of that. You have to feed, clothe, pay, and arm 400,000 men year-round.
You can't just wing that.
No, that requires a massive permanent bureaucracy. It requires incredibly efficient nationwide taxation.
So the constant threat of war actually drove the creation of modern government structures.
Absolutely.
If you couldn't tax efficiently, you couldn't field an army, and if you couldn't fight, you got eaten.
It was a very Darwinian political landscape. Strong states survived, weak states disappeared. And we actually have a perfect case study of getting eaten in the sources. Poland.
The partition of Poland. It is such a tragic story.
It is. I mean, look at a map from the early 1700s. Poland-Lithuania was huge. It was a massive territory. But politically, it was completely stuck in the Middle Ages.
The king was super weak.
Very weak. And the nobles were incredibly powerful. They had this legislative rule called the liberum veto.
Which meant a single noble could block any law, right?
A single noble could stand up in the assembly and just say, I forbid it, and the entire session was canceled.
So if you need to desperately raise taxes for an army to defend your borders, and one guy says no, nothing happens.
Nothing. Total political paralysis. Meanwhile, look at their neighbors. Prussia, Russia, and Austria were all becoming these highly centralized, absolutist military machines.
So between 1772 and 1795, those three neighbors just decided to carve Poland up.
They just sat at a table and sliced it up like a cake.
Until Poland literally vanished from the map.
Completely gone. Poland didn't appear again as an independent sovereign state until 1918.
Wow.
The lesson for the rest of Europe was brutal, but very clear. Centralize your power or die.
Which brings us to the ultimate winners of that centralization game, the absolutists. We talked about the constitutional exceptions earlier, but now let's look at the standard model for the era, France.
And the man who practically invented the brand, Louis XIV, the Sun King.
He has that famous quote, right? L'État, c'est moi. I am the state.
It is the ultimate statement of absolute sovereignty. But what the sources really highlight is how he actually achieved it, because he didn't just crush the nobility with an iron fist.
No, he domesticated
He
them.
domesticated them. That's a great way to put it.
And the tool he used was Versailles.
Exactly. Versailles wasn't just a ridiculously fancy palace. It was a gilded cage. He literally forced the high nobility to leave their local power bases and come live there for part of the year.
So instead of being on their own estates, plotting rebellions, or building their own armies, they were at Versailles obsessing over what? Who got to hold the king's candlestick at bedtime?
Literally, yes. He completely weaponized etiquette. He turned everyday politics into this elaborate theater where he was the star.
And while the nobles were busy acting in his play, who was actually running the country?
His middle-class bureaucrats, the intendants. Louis sent these royal officials out to all the provinces to collect the taxes, recruit for the army, and enforce his laws. He completely bypassed the traditional nobility.
But he also demanded total conformity in every aspect of life. I mean, we mentioned the Dutch tolerance earlier. Louis went the exact opposite way. He revoked the Edict of Nantes.
He did. He decided that a truly unified state needed one single religion. So he actively persecuted and kicked out the Huguenots, the French Protestants.
Which seems like a terrible economic move.
Oh, it was an economic disaster. They were some of his best merchants and artisans. But politically, it proved to everyone that his power was absolute. He was willing to sacrifice wealth for total control.
Now, if France is sort of the organic, glamorous growth of absolutism, Russia feels like the forcibly engineered version.
Russia is a completely different beast. Under Peter the Great, you see modernization delivered at gunpoint.
Because Peter inherits a Russia that is essentially still medieval, right?
Completely isolated from the rest of Europe. Very traditional. But Peter was this massive, towering guy like 6'7" with endless energy, and he was obsessed with the West.
He actually went there, didn't he?
Yeah, he traveled incognito to the Netherlands and England. He learned shipbuilding, studied their armies, their technology, and he came back to Russia with a singular mission. Russia must become European immediately.
The sources mention the beard tax, which always sounds like a joke to modern ears, but it was deadly serious.
Extremely serious. In Russian Orthodox tradition, having a long beard was a deeply religious symbol. Peter literally stayed at the court gates with a razor and cut off the nobles' beards himself.
He said, shave it or pay a massive tax.
Right, because he wanted them to visually look modern. He was forcing a cultural shift.
And he also wanted a capital city that looked modern, not Moscow, with all its wooden buildings and old traditions.
No, he needed a naval port. So he fought a long, brutal war with Sweden just to get access to the Baltic Sea. And then he built St. Petersburg on a literal swamp.
And thousands of conscripted peasants died building it.
Tens of thousands. But he didn't care. He called it his window to the West.
He also completely centralized religion, just like Louis did, but in his own way. He didn't trust the Orthodox Church.
Right. He abolished the position of the Patriarch, which is essentially the Russian equivalent of the Pope, and he replaced him with the Holy Synod, which was just a committee of government bureaucrats.
So he turned the church into just another department of the state?
Exactly.
And what about the nobles? He didn't invite them to a fancy palace like Versailles?
No, he put them to work. He created the table of ranks. This was completely revolutionary for Russia. In the old days, you were important simply because of your aristocratic bloodline.
But Peter changed the rules.
He said, no, you are important only if you serve me. Every single noble had to serve in the military or the civil administration, and your societal rank depended entirely on your level of service to the state, not your birth.
So whether it's Louis XIV using bribery and elaborate etiquette, or Peter the Great using sheer force and mandatory service, the end result is exactly the same.
The monarch is the government.
And that absolute model essentially dominated the European continent until the French Revolution finally blew it all up.
It absolutely did.
So let's zoom out a bit as we wrap up. We've covered a huge span from 1648 to 1815. If we boil all of this down for you, the listener studying for the exam, what truly defines this age of sovereignty?
Well, first and foremost, it's the shift in the why. Why do nations fight? We moved permanently from fighting over God to fighting for the state. State sovereignty became the highest possible value.
And we saw two very distinct operating systems emerge for managing that sovereignty.
Right. You have the constitutional model like we saw in England and the Dutch Republic, where the state functions as a partnership between the rulers and the propertied class.
Parliament and merchants.
Exactly. And on the other side, you have the absolutist model, France, Prussia, Russia, where the state is a massive centralized machine driven by one single man.
But both of those systems, regardless of who is at the top, were ultimately fueled by the exact same things: a globalized mercantilist economy, brutal colonial exploitation, and the creation of a massive military bureaucracy.
And honestly, that bureaucracy is the lingering takeaway of the whole era.
Which is exactly the thought I want to leave you with today. We always talk about this era as the time when the divine right of kings finally faded away, bringing in modern politics. But looking closely at the sources, it seems like the average person really just traded one master for another.
That is the big, provocative question. Think about it. In 1648, you obeyed the king because the local priest told you God wanted you to.
Right.
But by 1815, you obeyed the state because the tax collector, the recruiting sergeant, and the royal judge told you to. The actual machinery of control became so much more efficient, so much more invasive, and almost impossible to escape.
The abstract idea of the state became a living, breathing thing. And in many ways, we are all still living inside that exact same machine today.
We certainly are.
Well, thanks for taking this deep dive into a massive slice of history with us.
See you on the next deep dive.